like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, John Slaughter, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. It feels like a long hiatus since the last time I was here, so it's good to be back.
Yeah, I was actually thinking the same thing. I always really enjoy our conversations, but as I've told multiple guests, anything that passes out of my immediate frame of reference tends to drop off, and so I'm really glad to have you back on, man. We're here today not just for kind of our normal discussions, but actually to talk about something pretty specific. So do you want to introduce that, John?
Yeah, so I recently finished my first novel, and it's been out for a month now. I think January 6th was, or the 10th maybe was the launch day. I don't know. But either way, it's been out a month. It's been doing pretty well. And I sent it over, to yourself and a few other people and got some feedback. And so far so good. You seem to like it a little bit, but if you want me to give a synopsis of the novel?
Yeah, sure. So just so I kind of get my biases out of the way, right? You and I have actually been talking about this novel for quite some time. And I guess about a year ago, plus or minus, you sent me kind of the first draft, right? It was maybe 30% done, but had a lot of the frameworks of it. And so I received that, really enjoyed it a lot, and then kind of gave you back an annotated copy. And then, you've obviously finished the book. So I may be a little biased, but I quite like it. I'm going to say, let's not spoil the entire thing, right? We can certainly talk about it and mention a lot of the themes in it. But if this sounds interesting at all, highly recommend go down to the link and pick up a copy of John's book. Not just because he's a friend of the show, but because it is worth your time. And also, just to compliment, it's a very well-bound book. Like, it looks really nice. And so that's if you're the kind of person who just looks at books and doesn't read them, it's certainly useful for that as well. But sorry, back to you, John.
Well, I appreciate that, considering I did design the cover and I formatted the novel as well, which, by the way, is a lot harder than you think it is. Just future reference, but.
Well, actually, I've heard that same thing from Bagby, because he puts out or kind of republishes books, and he says that that's the thing that takes him the longest time, is actually typesetting the work.
Oh yeah, it's not. It took a lot of trial and error. Luckily, Amazon lets you get proof copies, so I could get them, a few days early, and then realize like I screwed it up. But after like the first couple of times, it turned out well. So. I'm pleased, and there's a hardback, which a lot of our guys haven't been doing hardbacks. And if you are a book collector like myself, obviously hardback is what you want on the shelf. So I went on my way to do that. So, and hopefully more of our guys will.
Well, definitely. So do you want to just describe the book in broad strokes?
Yeah. So the novel is sort of a blend of what I call Southern Gothic and noir. And it follows the protagonist is J.D. Hooks. He's a World War II veteran, and the novel takes place, about roughly 10 years or so after the end of the war. And he is returning back home to a small town called Arcadia, Alabama, because his father has passed away. And in doing so, and in returning home, he is sort of pressed into the situation where he's going to inherit his father's law firm, because he's a lawyer himself, and it is a town that is corrupt from top to bottom, and it's run by organized crime. And so when he comes back home, he's put into this situation where he's going to take over his father's law practice, but he finds out that his father was in bed with the local mob boss, and the mob boss, whose name is Orrin, wants him to continue this same relationship that he had before. And he has this he's conflicted on whether or not he wants to do that because he doesn't want to be in town. And while in the process of sort of dealing with this, he tells him no. He ends up losing. He becomes disbarred and can no longer practice law. So he starts moonlighting as a private investigator. And a young woman from a wealthy family comes to visit him and asks him to find her sister who has gone missing. And from there, the novel sort of follows his investigation into that while simultaneously dealing with the fact that he has to come home to a place he doesn't want to be, and what he's going to do if he manages to find this girl, or if it's even worth it in the first place.
Yeah, so I will say I really enjoyed this book. It's always difficult, right, when you're writing a piece of genre fiction, because there are so many kind of tropes associated with that. And so I'm curious, right, how did you approach that in this work, right? Because there's a lot of noir that is pulp, and there's nothing wrong with pulp, right? But that's somewhat different than what you wrote.
Yeah, so I draw, and this is something that I've debated with other writers before. There's sort of there's a gray area in here, but the difference between literary fiction and genre fiction, and for me, the way I define that is genre fiction is plot driven, right? So if we think of like a John Grisham novel, you can pretty much interchange most of his characters, and the novel itself, it won't change the story or the theme much, as opposed to something that is literary fiction. When we think of, like we've talked multiple times about All the King's Men is a good example, because if you were to change any of the characters within that novel, it would change the entire novel, right? Because it is character driven. And so what I did was I've always loved noir, so I took the scaffolding of noir with all the tropes that you normally have, and I tried to use that to build deeper, more meaningful characters, and have that be the driving point of the plot. So when I took, every noir has sort of the femme fatale character. So obviously you have that, but she had to be deeper than just this sort of stand-in piece to drive the plot. So every character needed to have deeper motivations, and more sort of a philosophical bend towards their character arc in order to blend those two genre, or blend those two types of stories, I think. And so that's the way I approached it, was trying to just use that scaffolding of noir, but take everything more seriously.
Yeah, there were obviously, because I, gave you suggestions, I have kind of an insight to the creative process. And, one of my major suggestions is I thought it would, suit the novel to create a kind of comparison between, Hooks and his father. Because in the draft I read, which was admittedly unfinished, his father was not much of a character, right? He was it's more of an inciting incident, right, than an actual figure. And so I'm curious, right? How did you want to create, a dichotomy between those two men?
Well, first of all, your suggestion was more than helpful, because that kind of helped jumpstart the father's role in the novel being more prominent. Because before then, he was just sort of a plot device to get him back home. But once I kind of explored, I went back in time and brought in some of the events prior to where the novel really starts. I realized the importance of having his father, and I wanted to sort of draw this contrast between, because I'm a father myself and I have two sons, and I thought a lot about this position you're in, where you want to tell your kids to do things, or tell your children to do things, but then oftentimes you can't live up to that yourself, and you end up in this sort of do as I say, not as I do mentality. And I wanted to kind of explore how that affects a man as he grows older in his relationship to his father, especially if he sees his father as an honorable man, but then has to deal with the fact that his father turns out to not be as honorable as he thinks he is, but at the same time, he comes to the understanding of why his father was that way, if that makes sense.
Well, definitely, right? Like it's the difference between realizing, oh, your father is a bad man and your father was, a man who was forced by circumstances to compromise.
Right. And also, Hooks as a character, one of the important things for me is um I didn't want to make him an out and out sort of white hat good guy. Um because I don't feel like that's not reality. Most people don't fit into that box. And so he's not a strict moralist. He doesn't have a strong moral conviction. I mean, he still has underlying this drive to do the right thing when push comes to shove, but it's not, he doesn't operate his life with a set of value systems. And in contrast to his father, who does have a strong set of value systems, but doesn't live up to them. Whereas Hooks as a character doesn't have a strong value system, but still almost lives closer to his father's example than what his father lived up to.
Well, and that's an interesting, dichotomy in the book, right? Is the distinction between principles and morals. And I think it's really one of the strengths of your novel.
Yeah, I think a lot of people conflate the two, and they don't necessarily understand that. And I don't remember. I wish I could remember the exact line I have in there, but I try to make the point that even operating throughout the world of not having morals or convictions is you still have convictions, right? You're still making a choice to do something, and that is something that is drawn out with his father, who watches his own father sort of plant his feet in the ground because of a situation, and he sort of picks a hill to die on, and then in turn his son, witnessing this, chooses to not pick hills to die on, which in itself is, it's still a sort of a conviction, right? You're still making this decision to live in a specific way. And so I wanted to draw this point of like, everybody has these things, whether you want to believe you have convictions or not.
Well, definitely. One of the other interesting characters, although he makes relatively few direct appearances in the book, is this crime boss, Oren. And there's certain ways when Oren is just an out and out Machiavellian, right? And he shares thoughts about power that are very similar to ones that you hear in our circles, right? He directly says, "I am order." And what's interesting is, after Hooks declines his offer to basically work on retainer, right, to become a mob lawyer, he says something really interesting. Spontaneous order does not exist, JD. All order is downstream of power. Some men understand this and they draw close, hoping to feed on the scraps from the master's table. Others are indifferent. They wish to avoid attention, and they will do whatever is necessary to stay in the master's good graces. Then there are those that require convincing, those I must bring to heel. I thought that was a really interesting section of your book. And so I'm curious, what were you trying to say with the character of Oren?
So I one of the things, and I don't want to spoil too much, but because I want people to read it and be sort of not shocked. It's not the intent of the ending, but the revealed ending is important. So Oren operates in a town that is completely run, and everything is dictated by organized crime. But without him, that town would be lawless, right? And what I was trying to show was that there is a degree to which all order, well, excuse me, no order is spontaneous at all. So this town running the way it does, even though it's crime ridden and horrible, it is much better than it could be, because there is somebody that shows up to lay down the law and keep people in check. And I wanted to kind of comment on the fact that you have people that no matter what type of order or law comes into effect, they're going to do what they need to do to either get as close as they can and sort of live off of that power. There are those that are going to fall in line in order to not rock the boat, and then there are those that naturally are going to push against it. But regardless, they're all having to fall under the purview of of the sovereign, so to speak, and this person in charge. And I think a lot of people have this idea that the law itself is what keeps order, and I don't tend to believe that. And that's sort of what Oren's speaking to, is he's the source of all this order. Everything falls from him. With if he were to go away tomorrow, nothing's holding that together. And we I guess maybe for me it's sort of a critique on this idea of the rule of law, because I don't really tend to believe that the law is what dictates things. It's who wields the law.
Right. So that idea that, essentially all power is derived from violence, right? That is the kind of like the ultimate authority, to paraphrase Heinlein. So one of the other characters in the book is Frank Taylor, right? A police detective who, kind of continually, I would say, rubs up against, right? It's a friendly relationship with Hooks. And the two kind of go back and forth, talking about, the morality of what Hooks does. And there's an interesting, the introduction of this character Taylor, right, early in the book, where we see kind of a crossover, right, where, one of Hooks's clients, right, a woman, assumed that her husband was cheating, went to a private eye, paid him to, investigate. And he came back with evidence that he was in fact cheating, and his wife, committed a murder-suicide. So I'm curious, right? That is, an instance in when, Hooks effectively, causes a murder. And so there's kind of this discussion about, whether it's better to know things like that, which is, again, something you see throughout the book, right? Because the rest of the book is, really concerned with Hooks investigating, right, the disappearance of, another woman. And so I'm curious, right? How do you see, Hooks evolving through the book, and how do you view that question of, his actions, right, and the consequences of them?
Well, he's a character who, I think you can tell when you're reading this, he's grappling with larger questions about the world, but he's surrounded by people who don't necessarily do that. So he kind of always has this problem of overthinking things, right? Now, as you mentioned before, there's a section in that chapter where he makes a reference to the fact that Hermes, being the messenger, right, of the gods, like whether or not he ever felt guilty for carrying these messages, right? Because I think for Hooks, he draws this distinction as a character between knowing a thing, to basically suspect a thing, or to believe a thing and know a thing, right? And so her belief, using the woman who kills herself, using that her sort of inciting incident, which is she believes her husband is cheating on her, which is one thing, and then to truly know that is completely different, right? It completely changes the outlook on the world. Even though she may have had these problems with her husband and she does believe he's committed adultery, to actually know he committed adultery completely changes everything. She can't handle that knowledge, right? And for Hooks, as he evolves throughout the novel, he has to come to terms with a similar thing, which is he believes things or he intuits things, but then when he has to come face to face with them, the world changes, right? The minute that it becomes tangible and real, everything is different. And you see this, and I won't spoil it, but this is also part of what happens towards the very end. Once he has full knowledge of this life that exists out there, we'll say, everything changes. He can't step away from it. Whereas if that life had been a thought or a belief, it's completely different. And I think for him as a character, you see his reaction to knowing or to believing in something, to actually seeing it, and how that immediately shifts a person's outlook. And again, this kind of also goes back to the same thing we talked about earlier with his father. His father can believe, like, for example, in the novel, I kind of allude to this fact that his father was was a relatively patriotic guy, and but then when World War II kicks off, he does everything in his power to keep his son from going to the war. Now he's okay with other people's sons going, but the minute that becomes real, that belief that he's willing to send his son to fight conflicts with the knowledge that there's actually a war going on. His son might have to go fight and die. So this entire, I really wanted to play with that idea that people hold something as a belief, but then once that belief becomes true, everything changes.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, that, right? Because again, obviously Hooks is a veteran, and soldiers appear, not often, but kind of at multiple times in the book. In the opener, right, there's this kind of tableau, whereas Hooks is, walking, from one location to another, right, kind of investigating. He comes across a couple bouncers, basically beating up a young soldier, right? And again, right, the contrast between, how he views the war. There's a scene later in the book where, one of kind of another character basically asks him, does he feel any guilt for the men he's killed? And the contrast between, his very kind of like measured, I hesitate to use the word, but kind of like worldly view of violence and fighting, and then that both expressed by his father, and what we see in the young soldiers. It's kind of an interesting motif there.
Well, I kind of went that direction with it because, obviously, I was in the Marine Corps, and I've been around obviously a lot of other veterans, and I really kind of get tired of this trope you see in other novels or films where the veteran that has returned home is just plagued by like this insatiable guilt, this like PTSD riddled sort of depression that he gets trapped in for the things that he's done. When in my experience in dealing with other people, it's never really like that. It's more of a numbing feeling. The violence just becomes part of reality. Like yes, it sucks, your friends get killed and things like that, but I very rarely have ever encountered anybody that's just plagued by guilt. It becomes more of an understanding that this is the way the world operates and violence is a part of it. And I really wanted to sort of drive that home, that like he's not necessarily happy with what he's done. And it's not to say that he glorifies the violence or he looks for it or he wants it. He just sees it as a natural part of life. And especially, I kind of also play with this idea that he realizes that that's where the real power, as you're saying earlier, sort of all power is a downstream of violence. He realizes that in the war, that there's, whether you can debate who's right or wrong in the conflict, but it is the power, it's the violence that decides. It's the deciding factor at the end of the day, or who can wield that most effectively. And that realization is not necessarily a negative or a positive for him. It's just the realization. It becomes reality. He now sees the world in this way, that, okay, this is how things operate. So even when he sees the soldiers getting assaulted, like, yeah, there's obviously a part of him that's like, yeah, this isn't right. But he also doesn't see it as this horrible sort of, moral failing by the society or the bouncers themselves.
So one other character I want to talk about, and you mentioned it at the beginning when you were talking about genre fiction, is Veronica, right? Oren's sister, who's kind of the femme fatale. And, their relationship is kind of interesting because it's made very clear, because she is she's a lounge singer. She is a creature of desire, that, Oren would react very negatively if it found out that she was involved with a man, right? It basically implicated that, people have tried and they have met messy ends. And nonetheless, right, Hooks is involved with this woman. So I'm curious, right? You said you wanted to make her a more complicated character, and she certainly is. But also, right, there's a section at the end, kind of in the final confrontation, which again, I don't want to spoil, where, Oren basically talks to Hooks and says, like, if you would have been upfront with me, if you would have been honest, I would have let it slide. I, think you're a decent enough guy. And that's actually, speaking back to your thoughts about violence, one of the most interesting things about Oren is that, his actions really are depersonal. Hooks is, their conflict is really because of Hooks's investigation, right? It's not like he personally dislikes him, even though he's sleeping with his sister. So I'm curious, right? What were you trying to accomplish with the character of Veronica? How did you want to, distinguish her from kind of the classic, femme fatale? And then, how does that, and how does that inform, our understanding of kind of the main villain?
Well, yeah, one of the things that ironically, or I guess to an extent ironically, that people have told me is that I write women really well. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that when I approach female characters, I really try to apply what limited knowledge any man can truly have of female psychology. And so when I look at Veronica as a character, she's a femme fatale, but I tried to understand that she has her own wants and desires and things that drive her, and that is based sort of in her female nature. So for her as a character, she's not just a sexual object or an object of desire. She is she is an independent operator within this world, and she has her own wants. And I thought a lot about how there's this. I've had this conversation with people before. Women, in a lot of ways, are more pragmatic than men are, even though we tend to think of women as being romantics. And one way you see this is not girls, but women often will choose to not marry a man they're in love with. And the reason is often because even though they love this man, they don't see potential in him. They don't see a future because they don't see him as being able to, maybe he's not ambitious or something like that. And so for using that sort of understanding that women will sort of look at the world that way in sort of a utilitarian way to an extent. I looked at Veronica and I said, okay, she lives in this world where her brother is basically the mob boss. He runs this entire town. And so because of this, by default, she gets to operate as like a princess. She has everything she could ever want, right? She doesn't, money, clothes, vehicles, house, like she doesn't want for anything. And her as a character, there's this conflict where and I don't know how well this came across the book, but she does actually love Hooks. But that love is second to what she wants in life, which is to maintain this position. And she would rather have this position of sort of authority or, special status than to risk, running off with him and living life as a sort of a second-class citizen or something. And so I wanted to give her that as a sort of, she operates that way. She's conflicted by this, and that gives her own set of motivations that don't just make her this sort of one-dimensional character that's there to drive the plot forward. And I honestly think a lot of writers forget that, that women have these sort of these pragmatic tendencies, and they kind of end up turning them into just these stand-in pieces. But in relation to her brother, what I was kind of drawing on there is that Oren is well aware that everybody wants his sister, and because of this, she is sort of a political tool. But she's also getting a bit older, and your looks do fade, and so he was actually okay with the idea of her being with Hooks because of Hooks's status, coming from a decent family, being a lawyer, being a veteran, all these things. That was valuable enough that if Hooks had come under his wing and worked for him, that would have been a beneficial relationship. He would have had no issue with it, right? Because he's like you said, he's completely pragmatic. Everything is impersonal for him. Even in sort of the crescendo of violence that occurs towards the end of the novel, for Oren, none of it was set in stone, right? This was all a result of him having to clean up messes that occurred along the way. He would have much rather preferred to handle things differently, but he's a pragmatist first and foremost. So that's the way he handles things. Is when they're presented to him, he sort of attacks it at the not say the lowest level, but the most effective level possible. And so there, because of this, he would have seen the relationship between Hooks and Veronica as beneficial had Hooks been in that position. But it's because he made these certain decisions that put him in the position where he's sort of turned against him.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing there. You mentioned that people had picked up that you were good at writing women, and there's actually, it's a pretty minor scene, but there's a section where Hooks talks to the receptionist at a hospital, and as someone who's done that quite a bit, right, talking to window witches, as they're referred to, I thought that scene was absolutely hilarious. It was not a comedic scene, right? But you write a very, I guess, interesting kind of feminine supporting character there that I thought was really well done.
Well, that was actually pulled from personal observations of talking to, just over the years, talking to women who've worked in hospitals and stuff, and I had picked up on that a lot of times there's this like weird, there's this sort of female hierarchy that exists within these offices, and it's almost always based on looks, right? And so I thought, okay, if this character is sort of past her prime, right? And I've seen this a lot, where a woman who's past her prime and was attractive at one point in time and no longer is, cannot stand the presence of a younger, more attractive woman in the office. And I kind of use that as the basis for the motivation of that conversation. Is like, well, she's willing to give up all this information because she has a problem with this other woman, and it's strictly because she was the pretty one at one point in time and now she's not.
Yeah, it again, a minor character, but nonetheless kind of one of the highlights of the book. So we sort of danced around, right, the central thrust of the plot. And like you said, the plot is not primary, right? It's predominantly about the interplay of the characters. But we really missed the woman who kind of sets this all in motion, right? Evelyn Sinclair. And so I'm curious, right? What were your thoughts with writing this character? Because she's, she is complicated, right? There was a very simple way to write a character like that, right? Who's, concerned about her, missing sister, right? Is either kind of a hopeless damsel in distress. And in this case, right, there's a lot more going on. So I'm curious, right? What were your goals here?
So with Evelyn, again, similar thing is what I wanted to do is I didn't, in most noir, oftentimes, the femme fatale character, I kind of split it right between Veronica and Evelyn. Oftentimes the classic, the woman walks into the private eye's office and with a problem, and she usually kind of will, or a lot of times she will kind of also be the femme fatale character as well. So I wanted to split the qualities between the two. And as I did that, I looked at Evelyn and I thought to myself, here's a woman who wants to find her missing sister, but because of the nature of sort of what happens towards the end, it's not so much driven by love and a desire to get her sister back as much as it is driven by the fact that her sister has caused certain problems that need to be fixed. But as I wrote that out, I kind of wanted to reverse it back, so that way halfway through the story, you're turned back onto the fact that she has this guilt about her sister. She's still a big sister. So essentially, it's really hard to do this without giving away the plot to explain it. But her sister has done something that has got her into trouble. She hires Hooks to find her sister. It's sort of implied at first that this is strictly like, oh, I love my sister. She's missing. We have our problems because every family does, but I want my sister back. You kind of reach this point where you've realized that there's more of a sort of a selfish motivation to why she wants her sister back. But then to kind of turn it back again and say, well, there is that, but also she does feel bad because she does love her sister. So I wanted to kind of play with this relation, this idea of anybody who has siblings will probably understand this, especially if they don't get along with them. This conflict where you have a sibling who you don't get along with, and that you're tired of, and you push them out, and then they wind up in trouble, and you feel compelled to go back to help them. And so she's more than a one-dimensional character, because I wanted to play with that idea that sometimes, you have somebody in your life, especially a sibling who you don't get along with, you want to push them out, and then when they get into trouble, there's a deeper impulse within you to save them. So she's conflicted by sort of her nature as a sister, but then also her hatred of her sister as a person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's one of the most interesting, relationships within the book. One of the other, overarching themes, and we've mentioned this earlier with Hooks and his father, right? But is that of, your patrimony, right? What you leave behind. And there's an interaction between, Hooks and his half brother, who he didn't really know his mother. His mother, ran off, married another man, had a second family. And so I'm curious, right? What do you think of, the role of, children and kind of becoming a father, in your book?
Yeah, I mean, once you have children, and this doesn't apply to everybody, obviously, because if there's one privilege in life, it's having parents who care, and not everybody gets that, right? But if you do have parents that care, or you're the type of person that will care when you have children, and you have children, you realize that all of a sudden your life is no longer about you anymore, and everything you were doing, if you're doing it the right way, is to benefit and to bring your children up in the world, right? And so that's really that the entire sequence of that conversation between him and his half brother is kind of to highlight that idea that that there's an exchange between the two of them, where he tells them, when you have kids, you have to give part of yourself to them, right? And in order to do that, I forget now exactly how I worded it, but essentially there's only so much you have for yourself, right? And you have to give your children a part of you in order for them to move forward, right? Or to sort of help them out in the world. And with each one of those kids, you're giving more of yourself over. And this is that sort of that conversation plays into Hook's realization about his father later on, where it's sort of a pivot point, so that when he revisits his father's actions, he no longer sees them sort of in a vacuum as these actions of a man who did something that he doesn't agree with. He sees them as a father trying to give up part of himself for his son. So all of a sudden, your father trying to keep you out of the war is not necessarily dishonorable, but a sacrifice. So maybe your father did have these morals and values, but he was willing to give them up in order to help you, right? Because that's sort of the role of a father, is the sacrificial nature of it, right? Which also, again, I play with throughout the theme of the book, which is, in order to get redemption, you have to sacrifice. And so even though everything that his father passes to him, whether it's good or bad, he then has to deal with it, right? And so the only way that he can truly make up for the things his father has done is to sort of make the sacrifice himself, right? But in making that sacrifice himself, he's going to automatically lay that onto his son, right? If he has a child, right? And this continues onward, because I have this idea, and this is a little kind of off topic to an extent, but I've always had this idea that, if we look at a family that has been living in generational poverty, and I've often wondered how much of that could be viewed as the sins of the father continually being passed down in an unbroken chain, right? And so your great grandparents make horrible decisions, which then affect their children, who in turn make horrible decisions, which affect their children. And this creates a sort of a generational spiral. And the only way out of that then is to make some gigantic sacrifice that could reset or put you back into a position where your children will not be paying for those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's an interesting theme in this book as well, right? That of sacrifice. And you and I mentioned before we went live that you really wanted to change how many books in this broader genre, right, of noir deal with redemption. So do you want to address that?
Yeah. So I think this is probably a bit of I wouldn't say controversial, but this is probably where you see a combination of like my Catholicism conflicting with my growing up in an evangelical home, right? This is sort of, I guess, the more I think about it, that's probably a lot of where that conflict that I place into the novel comes from, right? Because there's a scene towards the end of the novel where Hooks is speaking with his uncle, and his uncle tells him, and I don't have it pulled up, but he basically makes a comment. He says that, everybody, you go to church and everybody's always talking about all the happy-go-lucky stuff and, forgiveness, that's this, that, and the other. And he says something to the effect of, basically, Christ is put on the cross and he bleeds, and in that blood is the sacrifice. You have to bleed in order to make the redemptive act, right? And so I wanted to take that, the sort of the contrast between and I'm not saying that this is the theological position of everybody in, like a Southern Baptist church, but the church that I grew up in, the way it was understood to an extent was that you sort of had this get out of jail free card, where you could do things, and as long as you said you were sorry hard enough, that was it, right? The slate was clean, you start over. And then I looked at sort of this more traditional, we'll say, Catholic or Christian view of the fact that you still have to pay for the things you've done wrong, and like this idea of like, even the apostles suffer, right? As close as they were to Christ, they still suffer. And so I really wanted to highlight this idea that, like, oftentimes, whether it's in noir or, like I said, from the environment I grew up in, it's like, okay, I've now decided to do the right thing, and therefore everything's going to go right from here on out. And I wanted to show that, like, even you've decided to do the right thing now, that does not free you from the consequences. Things are still going to happen, and if the thing you've done is bad enough, you're probably going to have to bleed for it, right? And so in the case of Hooks, he basically has to be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in order for there to be a future for him, right? So I really wanted to play with this idea that he gives up, he's willing, at least in theory, to give up his life, and that is where the redemption sort of comes from for him. Had he chosen to preserve himself, right, if that was his main goal, that redemption may not have been available, or would not have been available.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing, right? That kind of like trite idea of redemption, because if you take the kind of like biblical symbology, right? The idea is that there has to be a blood sacrifice, right? You have to give up something, real and palpable and painful to be absolved. And, in the case of Cain and Abel, right, God was pleased with one sacrifice and not with the other. And likewise, right, the symbology, right, is Christ is the ultimate version of that, right? That he, takes on the sins of all the world in dying, he takes that burden with him. But nonetheless, right, there is this idea that, a sacrifice is required to reset the balance. And it's an idea you can understand where it came from, especially in a Christian context, right? That, all that's required is just to say, all right, I'm sorry, and everything goes away. But, that's not real. That's not true. And, you see that perverted idea, in in criminal justice, in kind of interpersonal relations, in theology, right? That there is something about the world that requires restitution, recompense in a way that moderns are very uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's, it's not, I would not describe the novel as a explicitly Christian novel by any means. It's not, I wouldn't label it as that, but I did go into it with the intent of playing specifically with the Christian theme of redemption, because, growing up, all Christian media I had ever encountered was very happy-go-lucky, right? It was very like God is not dead, sort of like once you pray hard enough, everything goes according to plan. And I've always thought that that's sort of a poisonous way to view the world, because what happens when you don't get what you want, right? Like it's immediately going to create like a faith crisis. So I did want to interject some heavy sort of Christian themes so that it was done in a manner that, in my opinion, deals with the reality of the world and the idea of sacrificing and what that really means. Because the last thing I wanted to communicate was like, oh, Hooks decides to be a good guy, and now all of a sudden the world works out for him, right? Because that's not how things work at all. Oftentimes, a series of bad decisions, you have a series of bad decisions, you decide to change change your ways, but there's still a lot of inertia behind all that, everything you've done. Those consequences still keep coming. And like sort of the example would be like, if you get married, or let's say you have a kid out of wedlock and you don't get married, and you have now this sort of this situation where you have this sort of dual parent household, these split homes. You have to deal with that woman for the rest of your life, no matter how good you are, no matter how much you make up for it or try. That doesn't change the fact that the sort of the consequence of your decisions weigh forever, And so, kind of thinking of it in those terms, I wanted to apply that to this novel, because like I said, I don't like the idea that you get off scot-free because you're sorry.
Well, and that's something that, obviously is a mistake which can, ruin your life, but perhaps more importantly, it also completely ruins fiction, right? Like
Yeah.
you see this in the kind of like trite, classic scene at the end of the movie, right? Where the villain has been vanquished, the hero is standing on their chest, and one of the supporting characters come up and says, no, you can't kill him. That would make you just as bad as him. Right. And, the villain, says he's sorry and is, either hauled off to prison or, in some way redeemed. And, okay, look, that's a silly kind of like stupid example, but, it's one of the many things that makes, modern fiction ring hollow, right? That, the stakes that are set up in that kind of bounded rationality, right? The world that the author is creating are completely nullified at the end. Right, because all of this buildup is released in just the simple phrase like, "Okay, I'm sorry." It's silly, it's stupid, and one of the things that we were talking about before this, and I think that you did a very good job of, is that obviously these are themes that you are speaking to in the book, but there's never a moment where Hooks kind of mugs the camera and says, this is what I think about this is what I think about atonement. This is what I think about any number of these issues. And that kind of like didactic spirit is really easy to point out in kind of like low quality, like lefty trash, right? As is the majority of modern media. But as much as I hate to say it, it's something I see in our own guys as well, right? This desire to express an idea incredibly directly, incredibly simply, and in kind of this like didactic teacher-like manner. And so I realize I threw a lot at you there, but I'm curious if I can get your reaction.
No, I actually, it's interesting you bring that up, because maybe last week I actually wrote a Substack article, and I can't remember what I called it now. Where have all the art men gone? I think is what I called it. Anyways, I was thinking about something similar, which was, you don't see a lot of let's say, conservative or right-wing minded guys in the art scene, right? And I was kind of talking about why I think that is, but one of the things that I explicitly said in there was, I don't think that any art is good if you go into it with the intention of teaching a lesson, right? I think that the reason you need right-wing guys in art or conservative guys in art is because if they go into a story, whether it's a novel or screenplay, whatever, with the intention of telling the truth, then their right-wing bend or the conservative bend is going to come out in that, and the truth is going to be sort of filtered through that lens, which will give you that effect of like, okay, you'll see things even the author themselves doesn't see, right? Because even for myself with that, there's been things that people have pointed out that I never necessarily intended within the novel, because I went in it with the approach of, I'm just trying to tell a story and be as honest as possible about these themes, right? And because of that, things come out of it that either you don't intend specifically, and it gives it that subtlety that doesn't feel like you're being beat over the head, because once you go into it with sort of this moralistic vision, or I'm going to teach a lesson about this, you're going to end up with just really long versions of Aesop's fables. And not that Aesop's fables are bad, but like, they're made for children, right? And that's who the audience is. But that same sort of mentality of writing, it doesn't work with adults, because then it just feels very like you're pandering, right? Or you're just like you said, you're basically kind of getting in their face and saying, well, now listen here, Johnny, don't do that, and that doesn't work at all. So I think the only way to avoid that sort of problem, and even with our guys, is not to go into it with this idea like, well, I'm going to teach people, I'm going to put a bunch of Christian themes within my novel, or I want to talk Schmittian politics and hide it under this character. It's no, you just tell the truth about a situation, right? And if you want to write a story about redemption, you just go at that full force, but you don't try to turn into a Sunday school teacher.
Well, and that's an interesting point as we wrap up. One of the things that you see from like the anti-woke media analysis crew, right, is this idea that the problem with fiction is that people are putting their values into fiction. What we really need is to get back to a simpler time when we could just have, cool movies about, robots and going to Nam and stuff like that. And that's obviously missing the point, right? The lefties, right, the progressives, are not wrong when they say, all media is political. And really, when they say political, they mean theological or metaphysical, right? A claim is being made about reality. And so the answer, right, is not to either, try to write this kind of like perfectly isolated story connected to nothing, right? Just a literal description of a plot, or to make this kind of like horrible didactic trash, where you have, feminist heroes vanquishing, kind of like stereotypical high school jocks either, right? Those are very clearly bad ways to tell a story. But, when you have, an interaction, when you have a relationship to transcendent truth, that will come through in your work.
Well, I think that's exactly the difference, right? Is that if for the vast majority of us, we do have the truth on our side to one degree or another, maybe some more than others. But because you have the truth on your side, or you're working within a real, honest framework, you don't have to try to interject your politics. Whereas everything that the left tries to tell you is an inversion of reality. So they have to force it. They have no other option, because if I'm telling a story about a football team and I'm just being honest about it, there's absolutely no way I can have, a female quarterback, right? Without her, getting her hip broken or something. She's going to basically die on the football field. But if I'm telling a story about, whatever, like some camaraderie within a football team, I'm just being honest about it, I don't have to worry about interjecting anything, right? Because I'm not trying to put in some feminist, lens on it, or some lefty, crap about how the fact that, everybody's equal and we can all play football together. Like, I don't have to do that. And it feels forced because of the nature of the fact that everything they're telling you is the opposite of reality. So they're always going to have that issue. And I think they're not wrong, or nobody's wrong when they're saying that art isn't political, but for them it has to be political because there's no other option. Whereas we do have the luxury of avoiding being explicitly political because that truth comes out no matter what, right? And you see this through multiple different forms of how many times do they try to make films that are sort of a critique of the right, but they don't really work that way, right? Because you can't mock the truth and be on, like, you can't show the truth and mock it at the same time and expect people not to find value in that.
So, John, we are fast coming up on time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed your book. And so if people want to find you, if they want to support you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can find me at Substack at TexasJohnSlaughter.substack.com. There, mostly it's all opinion pieces. I was putting short stories, but it turns out the audience that likes sort of cultural critiques does not like. They don't really like short stories and fiction as much. So I don't put much of that up there. But you can also follow me on Twitter at jslaughteresq. And I think you said you've already shared the link to the book, but it's also my pinned tweet as well, and it's in my bio. So if you need to find it, you can grab it there.
Well, thanks, John. I really appreciated the conversation. I just want to reiterate my endorsement for the book. It's quite good, and not just because I am played some small part, right, in seeing it come to light. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also support us either directly with the links down in the description, because I know the crypto market is hot right now, or you can head over to our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Obviously, if you want to find yet another way to call me names on the internet, that's a pretty good one. So I'd highly recommend Axios. And again, John, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.